My mother and stepfather kicked me out of the house when my half-sister was born, because now they had a real daughter. Years later, I got my revenge. I, 25 years old, was expelled from my house 6 years ago, when my mother, 45 years old, and my stepfather, 49 years old, had my half-sister. My mother had me when she was very young, and her grandparents and parents were very traditional and strict, so they forced her to have me. She didn't even want to tell them she was pregnant, but unfortunately, my dad didn't know and told them before she could say anything. From what I've heard, she took the pregnancy test, and as soon as she saw the positive results, he called her parents and told them everything, because he thought it was news she would want to share with them. He didn't even wait to ask her, which was pretty stupid on his part, but that's my dad for you. Needless to say, they broke up shortly after that, and since they were never married, it was a much easier process. My parents met in college and had been together for a year when they got pregnant. But after this stupidity that my dad did, my mom left him. But she couldn't get rid of me because her family already knew, and they said that if she ended the pregnancy, they would disown her, so she had to go through with it. I know the story because she has told me several times, and she always reminds me how lucky I am to be alive today, because if it had been up to her, she would never have had me. It's always nice to hear that from your mother. She claims I am the result of my dad's stupidity, which makes her even more annoyed with me than she normally would be, and so I was raised to be as invisible as possible. My grandparents and great-grandparents made sure I was born, but they didn't consider what would happen to me after that. My childhood was difficult, to say the least. You know how my mother was, but my dad wasn't any better. My mom hates me because she didn't want me, and wouldn't have had me if it weren't for family pressure. She also believes that I was the reason she couldn't advance further in her career because she had to take care of me along with college and work, which is fair, I suppose. But resenting me just for being born and treating me badly as a child seems a bit excessive. Don't get me wrong, I didn't lack anything as a child because my grandparents paid for everything since my dad couldn't afford child support. So I had everything I wanted, but I still felt like I was nothing more than a burden to my mother, and she never did anything to make me feel otherwise. She never spoke kindly to me or showed me any affection, and even when I achieved something, she never celebrated it with me. It was like living with an older, very grumpy roommate who hated you for no reason and just wanted you to leave as soon as possible. And then, on the other hand, there was my father. He was much sweeter and nicer to be around compared to my mother, but he was just as incompetent as a parent, and I'm pretty sure that when I was a child, he definitely had some drug problems. I couldn't recognize it back then, but now I'm sure he was a marijuana addict. He always did strange things and said strange things, but I dismissed it as him trying to be funny mostly and didn't think much about it. He always attended all my birthday parties and had dinner with us once a month, but my mother also seemed to hate him, and I could always hear them arguing about his behavior. My mom didn't want me, but she kept me because her family had decided that my father wasn't capable of taking care of me, and honestly, they weren't wrong. They had to decide who would mostly raise me before I was even born, and my mother's family ensured she took responsibility and my father could only see me on weekends. But even that would only be implemented after a certain age. Before I turned 10, I lived with my mother full-time and only saw my father a couple of times a month. But after that, I was allowed to live with him on weekends, and it was a step back because after I turned 10, I realized my father was definitely not ready to be my father. He lived in a small apartment, and it was very evident that he couldn't afford to live the kind of lifestyle my mother was used to because he lived in poverty, and the living room had a distinct smell of marijuana. I also knew he couldn't keep a job for long because my mother complained about it all the time. She kept telling me that if my father wasn't a complete idiot, she could have at least left me with him half the week, instead of just weekends without her family pressuring her about it. At my father's house, I felt fine, but I didn't feel comfortable because I knew having me there was putting him in a difficult situation since he obviously couldn't live on one meal a day as he did. But nevertheless, he still made an effort to cheer me up when I was at his house. That's how my childhood was. I had to endure my mother and her constant reminders that I was not wanted in our house when I lived with her. And on weekends, I had to deal with my father and the state he was in. And then, when I was about 15 years old, my mother started dating my stepfather, Jeffrey. He wasn't a bad guy, but he wasn't good either. He was just indifferent to me, and to be honest, that was much better than my mother and father. He didn't talk to me, I didn't talk to him, and everything was peaceful. Anyway, they were together for a few years, and then when I was 17 they got married. 2 years later, they announced they were pregnant, and it really didn't concern me because it had nothing to do with me. I went on with my life and followed my routine as usual, but I had no idea what was coming. When I turned 18, I decided to take a gap year instead of going to college and get some work experience first. I regret that decision. I should have gone to college when I had the chance because my grandparents were ready to pay for it. But a few months after my 18th birthday, my mother and her parents had a very bad fight over some nonsense I don't even remember, and they stopped talking to each other. This also meant they stopped sending me money, and I was on my own. But fortunately, I was working as an intern at the time, so I was getting some money. On my 19th birthday, I started applying to universities, and my mother was 7 months pregnant at the time. Even then, she didn't tell me anything about what was going to happen when my half-sister was born. However, just a week after my half-sister was born and my mother returned home from the hospital, she and Jeffrey sat me down and told me they had something important to tell me. I was a little surprised because I couldn't imagine anything my mother had to tell me that could lead to something good. When they started talking to me, they said they needed the room in the house because now that my half-sister was born, they were going to hire a full-time nanny and needed to give her a room to stay in. There was the master bedroom that my mother and Jeffrey used to occupy, my room, and also a guest room. But my mother told me they were going to paint the guest room and convert it into a nursery, and of course, they couldn't let anyone into their own bedroom. So it was time for me to leave the house because I was already 19 years old, and as an adult, I had no reason to keep living with my parents because it was getting weird, and they needed their privacy. I thought it was pretty shocking because, although I was legally an adult, I still needed a home because, eventually, I would have to come back from college, and then I would need a place to go. I told my mother, and she said that whenever I needed to come back, I could go live with my dad. But that wasn't possible because at that time, my dad had become a severe addict. Not only did he have a drug problem, which was bad even if it was just weird, he had also developed a gambling addiction, and his home was simply not the kind of place anyone would want to go. And obviously I couldn't go live with my grandparents because they were not on good terms with my mother. And if they didn't want to talk to my mother, there was no chance they would want to talk to me because, to them, I was just an extension of my mom. This is also why I had never had to worry about money before, because as my grandparents wanted to take care of my mother, they also wanted to take care of me. But once their relationship ended, so did ours, and I knew this because I tried to contact them several times, but without luck. It was bad enough that I was kicked out, but I also had to start thinking about how I was going to pay for my college education because, while I was applying, I had simply assumed that my mother would do it for me. I knew she hated me, but I thought going to college would mean I would be away from her and the family, so she would help me with that. When she told me she was kicking me out of the house, I asked her if she would be willing to pay for my college education. She just laughed in my face and said that not only was she kicking me out, but she was also cutting any ties she had with me because she had served her sentence, and now that she wasn't even in contact with her parents, she had no reason to keep me with her. I was shocked that someone could be so cruel, and I ended up crying, but she just made a face and told me that if I was going to cry, she preferred that I did it outside the house because I was ruining the atmosphere of what was supposed to be a happy day. Before that day, I had never said anything to my mother because I simply didn't want to argue with her or waste my time. But that day, I decided to stand up for myself because I wasn't going to be kicked out of the house in silence. I was going to go out kicking and screaming, but I would let her know exactly what I thought of her. I told her she was a terrible mother and always had been, and I was actually happy to finally get rid of her and that my life would be much better without her. To that, she just turned around and told me she didn't care about any of that and just wanted me to leave because now that she and her husband had a real daughter, they didn't need me anymore. And I was just as unwanted as before, if not more. So I broke down once more, and I think that was practically the worst day of my life. But still, I pulled myself together a bit later, packed my things, and left the house, never looking back again. Once I left, I went straight to my dad's house and knew that no matter what state he was in, I was going to fix it and make the best of my situation because I wasn't going to let my parents and their neglectful attitude ruin my life. When I got there, I realized my dad was in very bad shape and his house was even worse. I couldn't even tell when it was last cleaned, judging by the looks of it, and there was trash all over the floor. He probably hadn't even bathed in a long time. By then, I knew he hadn't had a job for almost a year. He was losing money left and right due to his gambling addiction. He was lucky that his dad had passed away a few months ago and left him some money, which he was now wasting. As soon as I arrived at my dad's, he tried to tell me he was happy to see me, but he was too high to say anything. He just smiled at me and thought that would be enough. But I wasn't in the mood. I had already had a very bad day and simply couldn't deal with it anymore. He had a joint he was smoking. So I walked over to him and snatched it out of his hands because I was going to make sure he stood up as a father and did everything for me that he hadn't been doing my whole life. I wasn't going to let his bad habits ruin my life. So I told him I was here to stay forever because my mother had kicked me out, and now he had to make up for everything he hadn't done for me and really change his behavior. He thought I was joking and tried to pick up his joint from the floor, but that's when I lost it and ended up slapping my dad across the face. I regret it. I shouldn't have done it, but I was losing my mind about my future and just lost sight of what was important at that moment. But it didn't lead to anything bad, so I guess it was meant to happen. When I slapped him, I immediately started apologizing, but he was really angry, so he went back to his room and closed the door. There was only one room to begin with, so I decided to stay in the living room. But the next morning, it was he who came to me and asked what exactly had happened the night before. He was already sober by then, so I told him everything in great detail and told him that I now needed his help and wanted him to improve his life because I wanted a better future for myself. And for that, I would need his help and cooperation. So he couldn't just gamble and do drugs all day as he was used to. He was a little surprised that my mother had kicked me out and called her to ask about it, but she didn't answer. So that was the day it was decided that I would live with him, and since he had no money, he couldn't afford to send me to college. But he promised me that he would do his best to be a better father to me, because that slap really woke him up in an important way. It wasn't easy, and it was an uphill battle from that point on, and my dad relapsed into his old habits several times over the next few years. But still, I stood by his side and he promised me he would keep trying to get better. I couldn't go to college, but I also couldn't waste time at home, so I decided to apply for some internships at some companies. And I got selected for a few of them. They paid well, but not enough to support a nice lifestyle or pay for college because if I applied to go to college, I would have to leave and give up my internship, and then I would have no money. I wasn't ready to take out a student loan because at that time, I wasn't sure if my dad would be able to improve his life, and I didn't want to dig a hole for myself that I couldn't get out of. So I dedicated myself to working, and when I wasn't working, I was doing household chores because the house had to be clean, and I couldn't allow my dad to live the way he had been living for so long. I wasn't the only one looking for a job, my dad was also doing the same. But since he hadn't been working for a long time and had a bit of a bad reputation due to his previous employers who didn't like him, because he was always high at work, it was harder for him than it was for me, and it was also much more frustrating for him because his daughter was bringing home money, but he wasn't, and that certainly irritated him. However, neither of us had anywhere else to go, so despite everything, we had to stay together and deal with everything together. And then, finally, about 3 years ago, something great finally happened to us. My dad was working as a store manager, but he was barely paid, and the hours were long, and I was working as an accountant. And they paid a little better, but it was a very tedious desk job. However, one of my friends who lived in another state told me that her father was expanding his business and opening a new branch in my city. This friend of mine had known me since we were in high school together. Her parents divorced, and she moved to another state with her father, but she comes back for the holidays every year to meet with me. And that's what we usually do. She knew all about me and the problems I had been going through over the last few years. She had even offered to help me with college tuition, but I couldn't accept money from her because then I would know that I owed her money, and I couldn't live with that. I had refused to accept money from her and her father, even though they were happy to help me and were quite wealthy, since her father had a large-scale office supply business. Recently, they decided to expand, and she contacted me to let me know that she had a job offer for me because she knew I was looking for something. I was a bit scared that she was doing this as a favor to me, so I asked her about it. She said that her dad usually wouldn't have considered someone my age for a position like this. She convinced him because she knew I could do it and simply had the determination and ambition. She trusted me and knew that I was capable enough to handle it. Technically, it was a favor, but she assured me that she also had faith in me, which is why she was doing me this favor. So she asked me to become the corporate liaison for them, and I was happy to accept that position. It came with a much better salary, and I would have to work more hours, but I was happy to do it. I also asked if they had a vacancy for my dad, and given his qualifications and past work experience, they decided to make him the warehouse manager because he had experience in that field and had worked in that position before. So we were set, and that was the first time something good happened to us. Since then, things have only gone well, and my dad and I are much better now. He completely quit marijuana and doesn't gamble anymore. We moved to a much better house in a nicer neighborhood and have been living here for the past 2 years. Things are going very well, and I really couldn't ask for more. 6 years ago, I couldn't have even imagined being in this place. As for my mother, I had no contact with her after leaving the house, and I have no idea what she has been doing all these years. But 2 weeks ago, she contacted me and said she needed my help. She sounded quite desperate, and I could tell that something serious had happened, so I decided to listen to her. Apparently, my mother quit her job shortly after I left, and she and Jeffrey started their own business, but unfortunately, it had been going badly for a long time, and I don't know why. But they kept investing in it and putting money into a place where they knew they weren't getting any return. So, surprisingly, they ended up bankrupt and now had a lot of debts and were selling everything to pay back all the people they had borrowed money from. But then they came up short. My mother had heard from a relative that my father and I had moved to a better house, so she assumed that we were doing well now. So she thought it would be a good idea to call me and ask for help. She didn't even apologize. She just said we should leave everything in the past and put aside our differences because this wasn't just about her. She also had a young daughter whose future was at stake, and if I had any kindness in my heart, then I would help them and pay off some of their debts. I thought it was very bold of her to ask me for help after what she had done to me, and just to annoy her, I decided to agree with her on the phone call and play along. But honestly, I had no intention of giving her any money or paying off any of her debts. Still, I told her I would look into it and help her only because I felt petty. So for a few days, I kept her fooled and talked to her every day while she told me about their finances and stuff like that. I listened, knowing I wasn't going to contribute in any way and that this was all just a ruse. But she didn't know that, and I kept hoping that she would apologize or something, but that apology never came. And that made me feel much less guilty about what I was about to do. And then, 2 days ago, she finally asked me when I was going to send the money. So I told her the truth, that I wasn't going to send her any money and that she had been fooled. I reminded her of what she had done to me all those years ago. And not only that, but also the way she had treated me during my childhood. She was foolish to expect me to help her after everything that had happened, and she hadn't even apologized, so she had no reason to expect anything from me. She was a terrible human being and a terrible mother, and I would make sure everyone knew it. So I hung up before she could say anything, and I made my post about all of it. I narrated my entire story and even included the part where my mother had come to me 2 weeks ago, begging for help and acting as if she was entitled to my money and contribution. It was just ridiculous and stupid of her, and I wanted everyone to know it, so that's why I did it. Personally, I don't see anything wrong with it, but my father thinks I took it too far and shouldn't have done it. I don't know what my mother's reaction was, because after that phone call, I practically blocked her everywhere, but I know my relatives can still see the post. And everyone who knew my mother now knows what she has been doing and how she treated me in my childhood. I think it was necessary to expose my mother because she always pretended to be a very kind person and a successful career-driven woman. But well, that was all a lie now, and I think I did the right thing. But my father thinks I shouldn't have said anything and just ignored her the first time she reached out to me for help instead of playing along and things like that because that's just cruel. And I'll admit it, it was cruel, and that was the intention behind it. She had been cruel to me my whole life. I think this was fair, and I'm not in a movie. I don't need to do everything right and set an example for other people. I can do whatever I want. But anyway, my father thinks I took it too far and is now insisting that I apologize. So am I the bad one for promising my toxic mother that I would help her pay her debts and then backing out at the last minute and then exposing her online? Update 1. Hi. So I followed the advice most of you gave me and decided to sit down with my dad to talk about the matter. It worked, which was nice. He really wasn't an active father for most of my childhood, or at all, to be honest. He was always high and seemed not to care about anything. Obviously, he didn't remember most things. But then I reminded him how terribly my mother used to treat me and how I basically had no one because although he liked having me around, he wasn't really there for me. That made him realize that what I did came from a place of anger and resentment, and I had been building it up for years. So what I did wasn't the right thing, and it definitely wasn't moral or ethical. But if it gave me an outlet for the frustration and anger of all those years, it was probably good for me. So he understood and stopped saying I needed to apologize to my mother. She never apologized to me for everything she put me through, and on top of that, she had the audacity to expect me to help her. It was a completely different level of arrogance. She hasn't contacted me since then, and it's been almost a week. I know everyone is talking about it because I've received a lot of messages asking about my mom, but I really have no interest in talking to other people about it. I posted everything I had to say. I have nothing more to add, and now I also have a lot of work to do, so I don't have time for this drama. What's done is done, and it's over now. Update 2. So my mom finally contacted me with a new number today after almost 2 weeks of no contact. She didn't have much to say. She just told me that she should never have trusted me and that she regretted having a daughter like me. But that's okay, the feeling is mutual. I also regret having a mother like her and would rather have been an orphan than spend my childhood with her. She told me that thanks to my little post, she couldn't live in this city anymore and had decided to move because the shame and embarrassment were too much. So I finally got what I wanted, according to her. But honestly, I don't really care where she is. She and I haven't been in contact for a long time, and I don't care where she lives. So that's something she's very wrong about, but that's okay. She's a narcissist and has a tendency to make everything about herself, so this isn't a big surprise. Anyway, I'm glad she's moving and that I don't have to talk to her again because she's blocked me. Update 3. Hey, it's been a month since my mother moved and things have been quiet. We no longer have contact, but I've heard from some relatives that she's apparently cut ties with her entire family and isn't talking to anyone. I guess that's good for her. My dad and I are still doing well. In fact, my dad just got a raise, so everything is good. And I can't complain. As for my post, I've deleted it. It already did all the damage it needed to do, and I didn't see the point of it staying up. If anything else happens, I'll be back with another update. Update 4. This update is to tell you something more about my mother, from the little I've heard. It turns out she is in the process of divorcing her husband, Jeffrey. At first, I was a bit surprised, but then I remembered how she is and it's no surprise. I don't have many good things to say about Jeffrey either, although given how the two of them are, I thought they would get along in some twisted way. What concerned me a bit more was that some acquaintances told me that my mother was expressing concern for me. They said she was worried about how I was doing, since I'm her daughter, despite everything. It's strange, right? After everything that has happened between us, she still feels the need to worry about me. But honestly, I find it hard to believe in her genuine concern, given her history. It's something I'm no longer interested in, and I hope it's not another trick to get money out of me. I also hope she doesn't come after my father now that he's doing better. Anyway, I'll keep moving forward with my life, focusing on my job and maintaining a healthy relationship with my father. The only thing I worry about is my half-sister, because growing up with that kind of mother is not easy. I just hope she treats her better than she did me. At least she was wanted. I don't say that out of jealousy, though it might sound like it, but because I genuinely worry about her, although there's little I can do.